welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Can you tell us your name and a bit about yourself and what interests you in the Women in Power project?
My name is Babs Blacker Eskin, and I go by Babs Eskin. And what interested me is I love the library, and I love talking about what it feels like and means to me to be a woman, so I'm really happy to be here.
So, what does power mean to you? How would you define having power?
Well, I began to feel my own power when I realized that my personal power came from within myself. There are two parts to it. One is to follow the voice in me that tells me to speak out unapologetically and respectfully, to speak out about what my opinions are and what I believe is the truth. The other part of power for me would be to have social equality and legal equality with men.
So do you feel that being a woman has caused you to experience power differently in your life? And if so, maybe how so?
Of course it's different for women in all ways. It was 1957. After 2 years of marriage, my husband and I had just bought our first house in Orland, Pennsylvania. We were sitting in the bank about to sign the papers for our low-interest 30-year mortgage because of the GI Bill. My husband was a Korean War veteran. We were expecting our first child. I was 23 and he was 28. We were very excited. After I read the document, my heart sank. I said, I can't sign this. The mortgage was in the name of Saul Eskin et Ux. Well, I had taken 2 years of Latin in high school, and I knew what that meant. It meant wife. My name was not on the mortgage. I still mumble when I say it, as I remember what it felt like sitting there. We were both silent. We were both trembling. We went home. We were both afraid. Each of us thought the other would blame us for losing the house. It was as if the sky had fallen. We were both silent. We went back to the bank and signed the papers. It was the worst 2 weeks of our marriage. So I think that's a fine example of what it means. The state of Pennsylvania had that law. Mm-hmm. Now, we didn't hire a lawyer, we didn't pursue it. We were both frightened and we just gave in.
So what were your husband's feelings about that at the time?
I think he was just as afraid as I was. I was amazed at how understanding he was, because he didn't say anything about being understanding, but I was taking a step that would influence both of us. And he just stuck by me.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say it was kind of your turning point in discovering your power or reclaiming it? Because it sounds like, at least during that episode with the GI Bill and signing that contract, that you felt like some of that power had been taken away.
Yes.
Yeah. What was your, how did you reclaim that later in life?
Thank you. Well, great. That helps me. I knew enough at the time to follow the voice inside me and follow my heart. I knew enough to say, I can't sign this. Mm-hmm. And that for me was power. Mm-hmm. And I then gave in because it was like pushing a peanut down the road. You know, I would never get there. So That was one thing. And also that I have continued, there was no way out of that for me but to give in. I've continued to follow the voice inside me, which helps, and I've tried to follow it with a sense of humor whenever possible. So I want to talk next about social and business events, because when I was in my early 30s, we moved to Fresno. My husband was active in the business world, and we went to a lot of events where you have a canopy in one hand, a glass in the other, and you visit with people and you talk, and you have a good time. Well, we were at these meetings talking to people, and men would talk to me, I would talk to them, we'd have a nice conversation, and it would always end with, "What does your husband do?" And I would finesse around that question maybe, or I would say what he did. And this was habitual. So at one point I said, and I also noticed how they looked at me. Men looked at me somewhere around my navel, not at my eyes. And I began, and I knew, because I knew exactly what that was. What that was is, if you're looking someone straight in the face, you're their equal. If you're looking at them somewhere else, you're the object. And I didn't like being the object, so I recognized it. And when I helped myself out of that feeling, the next time somebody said to me, "What does your husband do?" I said, "About what?" And that sort of let it alone, and I felt better. I couldn't change how people looked at me. I know what I can do, accomplish, and what I can't, even if it takes 50 years. Like, I'm still waiting for the ERA to pass, but it's only one state short, and it may pass. I don't mind waiting, but what I can't change, I move on with, and I don't feel bad about myself, because then you give up your power.
So how did you come to that understanding? Because that's a very strong position to be in, to realize that, you know, this is the way the social world operates, but I am still my own person.
Yes.
How did you come to that position of strength?
Because I believe in the voice inside. I believe we all have it. I believe it's what makes us love life, no matter what else is going on in the world that is awful. And I can't give that up, because it's who I am. So I just kept doing it. And the other part of it, laws and customs, well, I was in I think it was the late 70s or the early 80s before I could get a credit card.
Oh my
I could
goodness.
not get a credit card in Babs Eskin. Okay? I mean, and we never did, we didn't go in debt for anything. What we didn't have, we didn't buy. And we were young, and we were educated, and we had health insurance, and life was good and would get better, and we all knew, and we both knew that. But it was not good for me to not have that credit card, but then I got one, and I liked that a lot. It felt like I can be more my own person. I can get a Mileage Plus card, I can get miles, and I liked that.
So even something as simple as being able to have your name on a card was a source of power.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. I also remember Title IX in the 90s, and that was, Fresno State at one point was denied access to accreditation because the women's athletic department was not treated like men. So how did we fix that? Well, the way we fixed that was women. We got a clipboard, we got a yellow legal pad, we got a pencil, we investigated. Okay, how many urinals are there in the women's bathroom and how many are in the men? What are the hotels that men stayed in and the hotels that women stayed in? What were the buses like? What was the food allowance? What were the salaries? Well, it was not rocket science, but it got the job done. And that made me feel the power of women working together. So I really like that.
So do you feel in general that things have progressed socially for women through the efforts of other women? Or has it been, in your experience, kind of a collaborative effort between men and women?
Well, yes, it's through women's efforts. Because my mother was a suffragette. She was born in 1904, and she marched for women the power to vote. I can't imagine what it's like not to be able to vote. And what she did, when women got the vote in 1920, she was not quite old enough to vote, but 4 years later she was. And I knew that that was done through the power of women. The law was changed because women stood up for it. But I think men began to be interested in or to work for women's rights. Although I don't think they thought of it that way. I don't like to think of it that way. I like to think of it as about how you talk to another person and what they're deserving of. And why does there have to be someone under you?
So you changed your name fairly late in life. What brought about that decision? Can you tell us a little bit about that process and the thinking that went into it?
I always felt I had a voice as Babs Blacker. That's what I used on my library card when I was a little girl, is what I wrote on my tests in school. It's the name I used when I wrote papers in my journal. When I wrote essays, when I tried to write poems, I was Babs Blacker. When I had thoughts that were private, they were Babs Blacker. When I wrote letters, that was my name. And I was happy to get married, and it was fine to be Babs Eskin, but there was something left out of that. But I thought growing up and being married and having children and working and going to school and all that, it was okay. As I got older, I realized that this is part of my core of who I am. I am my birth name, and I wanted it back. And what I did was, I remember reading a poem where the woman wrote, "When you're old, you can wear purple." And on my 80th birthday, I decided I want to take my birth name back because that's a core part of my development and who I am. So I went through, I realized, I was told, you can do this in California, it's really easy. And you just go and do it. And it made me feel more connected to my mom and dad and what they had done for me and what their lives were like. My mother is a woman growing up in the early 1900s, and my father is finding her, an independent woman at 26 years old and a legal secretary, because her parents didn't want her to go to college or law school. So that was a big deal for a man to do in those days. And I liked that. And I wanted to honor them with that name. So that's what I did.
So what were other people's reactions to this change? Like your husband, your family and friends?
They were fine.
They were fine with it?
They were just
supportive?
fine with it. It was, it was my worry about all the paperwork and what to do and what I had to change and all that but no, they were fine with it. We have 3 children. 2 of them are married. One of them has kept her name. And her husband has kept his name, of course, and their children are both, no hyphens, their children are both. And people are doing this all the time. Men and men getting married, they're both taking the same name. Women and men, they're both adding a name and taking the same name. It's, in that sense, it's a new world. And I like that. And it just makes me feel that I have had a long and wonderful life that isn't over yet. And it gives me a feeling that I'm going to leave this life really the way I came in, with all of my parts. And I like that. I think being a person is a very big deal. And I like that about what my life has been like.
Now, you had spoken a little bit off camera earlier about what it was like to attend social functions.
Yes. Okay.
And then to go to work and be treated differently depending on whether or not you could have your name. Be
In
used.
the beginning, the first question, I said, I want social equality and legal equality. And thank you for reminding me of that, Kristen. It's important to me. When we moved here, and as I said, I was in my early 30s, and my husband was active in business, and I was part of women's group because there were more women's groups and men's groups than there were men and women groups together. And I would be at a meeting, and I would be at a League of Women Voters meeting, and they would take a picture, or the newspaper, or I would be in a fashion show honoring children, or Marjorie Mason Center. And my picture would be there, and it was me, and it said Mrs. Saul Eskin. Well, it wasn't me. It was somebody's wife. And professionally, when I got a job or when I worked somewhere, I was given the name Babs Eskin. But it was a long time before newspapers, before the culture began to call women by their name. And I didn't like it before. And I knew it was wrong. And I still have a feeling about it when we get mail and when it's not addressed properly. But it maybe seem like a little thing or something that doesn't matter, but for me, it matters a lot.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
I appreciate it very much, and I think everyone has a unique story.